graduated from Lafayette High School. He received his bachelor's degree from UK in the College of Agriculture, and then his master's degree from UK in guidance and counseling. He served our country in the U.S. Navy for 4 years during the Korean War. He married Betty Bishop, a member of Central, and they have been married now for 62 years. Warren was a teacher, agriculture teacher at Versailles High and also Bourbon County High. Then he went to Lafayette High School, where he was a guidance counselor and assistant principal. And then he served as the principal at Tates Creek High School for 13 years. He retired from Tates Creek in 1983, and he stayed retired for 6 years until Betty said, "Get out of here and go back to work." So he came out of retirement, and he was a principal at Henry Clay High School for 2 years. Warren has served this congregation in every way imaginable. He was instrumental in starting the Central Christian Church Foundation, which undergirds the ministries and mission of our congregation in perpetuity. He has served as a deacon, an elder, a trustee, a Sunday school teacher, the chair of the administrative board. He assisted with all of our capital campaigns and so many of our financial stewardship campaigns throughout the years. He was a former member of Rotary Club and served on too many local boards for me to enumerate. Let's welcome a very dear and foundational member of Central Christian Church, Warren Featherston.
I'm primarily going to share some stories with you for the battleground of being a principal. But Betty and I both grew up in this church. I really didn't know her very well. She was a friend of my sister's, and my sister insisted this was the person for me to marry, so I did. And I've always been very active here, and the church has meant so much to us. And as I told you last time, we probably are going to have to move closer to our daughter in South Carolina, fortunately not on the coast. And leaving church is going to be the most difficult thing. The closest disciple church there is about 10 miles away inside of Greenville, because where my daughter lives is in Greer, outside of Greenville. It's where the Greenville Airport is. And we visited the disciple church there. They didn't. Last time I was there, they still didn't have a full-time minister. We usually attend either the Methodist church or the Presbyterian church. The Methodist church changes ministers all the time. You know, they shift them around, so we'll probably end up in the Presbyterian church, which goes back to our basics anyhow. In fact, my great-grandfather, his name was Warren Barton Featherston. Wow. He lived back during the time of Warren Barton Stone. And so I don't know that was the source of the name, but anyhow, the Warren part's been carried down through the years. So I'll let you a little bit with you. Let's see, he said I majored in agriculture at UK. I had been a student when I was in high school, Future Farmers of America. You probably remember that organization. Believe it or not now, there are more girls in Future Farmers of America than there are guys. So things have really changed. But I enjoyed that work as working in ag and getting to know families, because you visited families on the farm, and frequently they would share with me a problem that they were dealing with their son. So I got interested, and I thought, well, I'll take a class in guidance and counseling, and then I continued on and got a master's in guidance. And later got certified in administration because the superintendent asked me to do that. And of course I was in Lafayette, Tates Creek, and Henry Clay. And as Bruce Cotton said, we've lost Bruce recently, but Bruce said, it's a shame you can't get along anywhere. You always have Bruce's humor is something else. I remember when E.T. and I were being initiated in the AGR's Alpha Gamma Rho. Some people call us Alpha Grab Your Hoe. But Bruce, they called on him one day to say the blessing. He said, oh my God, let's eat. They grabbed him up and beat the tar out of him. When I It came about the time I was a counselor at Lafayette, just before I became assistant principal there. It was in the time that the city and the county school system combined. I mean, the city and county government combined. And so they closed all of the black schools at that time, which was quite a shock. They divided up the town in pie shape, and each high school got some of the students. It was a very difficult time for those students because some of them had already been elected as officers in their class for the next year, or cheerleader, and certainly some of them had played on teams. So it was a very shocking period, an adjustment for them coming into a school that was predominantly white. I could understand that, but I also had had a good relationship and a wonderful experience in my life, and that on our farm we had a black family who was just like my parents. And whenever my mother and father were going to be late coming home from something, we always spent the night. And they had a son, and they named him after my father, so he was Warren, and I was Warren. And so when we were working out in the field together, and they say, "Warren, hand me that bale of hay," we didn't know whether it was black Warren or white Warren. And we remained friends for a long time, and then I lost track of them, and I'll tell you a little bit later how we picked up with that. But anyhow, I had the wonderful experience of growing up with black people and had a great respect for them and was interested in trying to help the students with their very difficult adjustment to school. But later then I became assistant principal at Tate's Creek, and things were pretty rough. We had a hard time. And Dwight Price, some of you may know Dwight. Dwight and I were assistant principals together. It seemed like we most of the time was in the hall always, dealing with different problems that were coming along during the day. We'd have to go back at night and do our office work. Then Dr. Potts asked me, it's about Thanksgiving time, if I would be willing to go to Tate's Creek as principal, that they'd had some unrest there that still wasn't settled. And with Dr. Potts, if you turn something down, you'd probably never be asked again. So he said, "Ask your wife." Well, we decided that we better attempt it. Unfortunately, I didn't know all the stories. In that day, the newspaper was locally owned, and they didn't kind of write about all the things that were going on. Very early, we had said to Dr. Potts, Dwight and I, we need some sort of security in the school system to help so we can do our job as principals. And so he began to check throughout the country about different programs with security in the various schools. And he flew some of us to different places to see what they had. Most of the time it was a policeman with a gun on their hip. And we didn't want that. So we designed a different program, and Eastern Kentucky University trained the people as they came into this position. All the school students were very anti-having security in the school, and would make cartoons out of them in the school paper and everything. We had one guy that was very muscular. I can remember the cartoon was a trash can with the muscles showing. So anyhow, they did not want to announce that I was leaving Lafayette and going to Tate's Creek until the 28th of December. And so I had very little time to get to know anything about the school. The principal that was leaving, and who had asked to be relieved because he had stomach problems, and I can understand why, toured me through the building and showed me where my office would be, and went through some of the teachers, and I tried to take notes and things that I might have to deal with early. So while I was there, 13 years. And we did have the security, which helped us so as administrators we could work with our class and with our teachers and other work that needed to be done. And things began to settle down. And shortly after I went to Tate's Creek, I invited the black students to come to this little theater. And because there had been a terrible cartoon in the school paper done by white kids. And that's why they had refused to go to class. And that's why I was called on to go out there. So I said to them, I can't change anything that's happened in the past, but I can try to help you feel more comfortable about your school now. So I want to know if there was anything I could do now that would make you feel better about the school. So I left him in the little theater, and I went back to my office, and I told him, when you decide, send a couple of people in to talk to me in the office. So 4 students came in, and they said, we want to have a talent show. The white kids don't want us in their talent show. So I said, okay, you can have a talent show. I'll send a teacher to work with you, and you've got to cooperate, and I'll be involved in hearing what's going on and how well that you are organizing that program, which they had. And I said, you must invite some white students to participate. I don't know how many they asked, but Ray Parsons sitting back there played the only one. Played the French harp, and he was their man from then on. He could do no wrong. Another difficult thing that happened along the way, I've kind of woven these questions that you gave me in with everything. But my father committed suicide, which was a difficult time for me. My mother and sister were out of the country. My sister had gotten her doctorate degree, and my father gave her a trip. She wanted to go to the Caribbean. So at the last minute, he sent my mother as well. I realized that he was somewhat depressed, which had been a problem off and on. But he wouldn't come to our house and eat and so forth. So I spent the night with him, fixed his breakfast the next morning, and I think I created a problem in that he had a plan and I interrupted it by spending the night. But anyhow, I said, I'll be back at noon. And so he said, well, I said, I'll call Helen and E.F., and that was Helen and E.F. Mars, who were in this church, if you remember, because they lived nearby. And he said, yeah, they can bring me up some breakfast. So he had it all planned. And he said, now leave the door unlocked, real harsh-like. I did, and went home to change clothes. It's summertime, to go to the school. And he went to the basement and shot himself. They found him because they went up to take breakfast to him. And so anyhow, I happened to go back to that scene and deal with the police and the coroner and the funeral home, and I called his attorney to see if there were any plans in his will about that, and who was also a member of the Central. And he said no, there was nothing, no instructions for that. Well, I called the travel agency, and by that time my mother and sister were in the air to come home, so they did not know till they arrived at the Bluegrass Airport. Leslie Smith was the minister at that time, and he went to the airport with Betty and me. And that was another difficult scene. And so those few days of up to the time of the funeral, and I remember sitting at the Lexington Cemetery, and it was a beautiful September day, and I thought to myself, I'm all through. I don't have any decisions to make now, which is wrong. Your body does something to you, but I passed out and broke out in hives and had to have a doctor. Anyhow, they threw that, but you never get rid of that experience. It crops up every so often. We had a couple of suicides of students while I was at Tate's Creek. One of them was a 10th grade kid that initiated to the Beta Club on Thursday night, and Saturday night committed suicide. And where did he do it? He came to the school, and they found him in the doorway outside of the school. A bright little boy. And he even went back a couple of homes and told other kids what he was going to do, and they just laughed it off, didn't realize he was serious. Later, we had a young man who was a National Merit Finalist, honored by the National Council of Teachers of English, played the leading role in a musical production for 5 nights, and went home and shot himself. Oh. And you just can't imagine, you know, how a person, and he left a note saying how he felt so inadequate. Can you imagine anybody with all those honors that feels that way? So anyhow, at Tate's Creek, there I am. And so in order to try to get to know students, I rode buses every place they went, with the teams, the bands, and so forth, to get to know students the best I could. And that was in the days they could smoke outside, which included marijuana, so I had that blown in my face on a regular basis. I didn't even have to smoke it. One of the situations I remember, the football team was going to play, I think it was Belfry, Kentucky, up in eastern Kentucky. And the team all loaded on the bus except one kid, and the coach wasn't going to let him go because his mother was seriously ill and didn't think she was going to live, and he wasn't going to let the kid go. And the kid cried and begged to go. And I said, let him go, Coach. And when we got back, his mother had died. His older sister and brother met us there. But anyhow, I think he fulfilled the request that she had made. So he dealt with things like that all the time. With the band, bands are hard to deal with, and their parents are hard to deal with. In fact, I'm surprised I didn't get fired because I was pretty adamant with parents about things. But they were raising money to take a trip to Canada and to buy new uniforms. Why they decided to do those two things and raise all that much money. But anyhow, they wanted me to come talk with them because they thought some of the money I made off of candy and potato chips in the bookstore, that I should share it. And I said, I didn't decide to go to Canada, and I didn't decide to buy a uniform, and I'm not sharing the money. And one guy got up and said, you just don't realize how much tax we pay. I said, well, let's see now. You've got a school building to go to school in. You have to have heat and air conditioning. You have teachers to teach you. You have books. I said, you have all kinds of things that you don't pay for. And I said, I know where you live. I know what subdivision you're in. They're nice homes. But you don't pay enough tax to get your kid in the front door. And so I said, what's the next question? It was silent. Sometimes you had to be, and people that knew me couldn't imagine me being that way. Of course, I was redheaded then, and maybe that had something to do with it. I had a secretary who was so much help to me. We had several secretaries, but she was my personal secretary. And she got to where she could write letters. If I would tell her what it was about, she could write a letter, and I didn't even have to dictate it. And that was really a wonderful experience to have. Every now and then I'd have to say, Doris, it doesn't sound like me. But she also nominated me for Boss of the Year one year with the Business and Professional Women's Club. And I don't know what else she wrote, but anyhow, I was selected, and we went to the banquet and got this lovely plaque, which I hung on the wall in the office. And 2 weeks later, I made her mad about something. She grabbed the plaque off the wall and threw it in the trash. She had real control. We had a girl that day, she was a black girl, and she was being disciplined by the assistant principal. I didn't handle most of the discipline. The assistant principals did. And I could hear her voice and his voice, and they were really going at each other. He gradually eased her out of the office, and her back was against the wall where she could look into my office. So I went to the door, I knew her name, and I said, you really are upset. And she was crying. She said, that old man, he doesn't like me. So I said, well, come on in and sit down. And I gave her a tissue. We talked and asked her about her home. And I knew a lot about it because she had brothers, and they were always had problems, didn't have much advice or help at home. And so as she got better, I said, well, I think you can go back to class now. I'll write you a note. She said, oh, by the way, what do you do here? She didn't know I was a principal. So I said, well, I just sign checks and help out in the office. And she said, well, if you don't mind, I'll just bring my problems in here for them. So those were all wonderful experiences. I went with the band one time. We were going to the Dogwood Festival in Knoxville. They parked the buses on a public parking place. During the day, it got dark, and a boy and a girl went back to the bus. Another girl decided to go get her camera, and this boy and girl were kind of having a lot of fun, and she told them to stop, and they didn't, and she took a flash picture. Interesting enough, there was no film in the camera, but the kids never knew that. So the band director said, well, they can't stay here with us. So a father who had driven down with his wife, the band, and I took this couple back to Lexington, so I never got to see the Dogwood Festival at all. That's the kind of things that you dealt with. And boy, talking about difficult, to go into two homes like that and share that information with parents, it's not fun. One morning I came to school and there were 6 tires down over the flagpole. And I didn't know how we were ever going to get them out. In fact, one of the guys came to a funeral recently, and I ran into him there. He said, "Mr. Featherston, did you ever find out how those tires got down over the flagpole?" And I said, "Well, I assume you were involved." No, I don't really know how. And I said, "You know how we got them out? It was either get a crane or they used a chainsaw and saw the tires to get them off." But these are the kind of things that kids love to do, which kept you busy all the time. We had a girl, you know, principals rarely got gifts at Christmas. The teachers did, but principals rarely got any gifts. But a little girl came in one time during Christmas time, and she said, "Mr. Featherston, I didn't have any money to buy you a Christmas present, but my mother has made you a sandwich." And she had it wrapped in Christmas paper with ribbon and everything. So I said, "Well, what's your lunchtime?" And she told me, and I said, "Well, when it comes time for your lunch, you come in here, and I'll get some chips and cookies and a drink, and we'll share the sandwich together," which was a nice experience. And that's how I got to know kids. One day I went in the hallway, and the kid was up chucking. Everybody else was in class, but he'd been out off the campus at noon, and I could smell alcohol in addition. So after I got the custodian to clean things up and got time to sit down with him, I said, "You had to be off the campus to get something to drink, I'm assuming." He said, "Oh yes, and I am so sick, Mr. Featherston, and I'm so embarrassed." I said, "Well, nevertheless, I'm going to suspend you for 3 days." And so that night, Betty wanted to go shopping in Fayette Mall, and while she was shopping, I wandered in this tennis shoe store and was kind of looking at shoes up displayed on the wall, and somebody said, "Can I help you?" And it was this boy that I had put out of school during the day for upchucking. And when I turned around, it was this kid, and he was as shocked as I was. And we sat down and talked. He said, "My parents were furious with me." So we talked for a long time, and I talked about what he thought his future was and what his favorite teachers were. It always gave me an opportunity to learn more about teachers. And finally I said, "How would you like to come back to school tomorrow?" And he said, "Oh, I'd love it." So he did. And I think he learned the lesson. We never had any more problems for that. I suspended another boy one day, and I don't remember what it was about, but his mother came in the next morning. She said, "You're not putting him out? I have no one at home to be with him. I have to work. His father and I are divorced. And I hear that you have favorites anyhow, and you don't treat all the kids the same." And she just went on and on and on. Finally, she stopped, I guess, to come up for air. And I said, "After meeting you, your kid's not so bad." And the boy says, "See, Mom, I told you he's Anyhow, I'm surprised I wasn't ever relieved of my job. After retiring from Tate's Creek, I just was worn out, night and day. You had to be there if there were as many as 50 kids in the building. If you were there at night, you had to be there, one of us. And I liked to do it most of the time so the assistant principals didn't have to assume that responsibility. And seems like that you just finally reach the point where you're just exhausted. And I'd asked the superintendent, "Is there anywhere else I could go for a year to rest up a little bit?" And he said, "Hell no." And so I stayed 3 more years, and then I retired. I had 4 years of military time I could buy in on my retirement, which helped me to. So anyhow, I had a friend who owned a sheet metal business, and he and his wife were getting a divorce, and the government was on him about things he needed to do for safety in the sheet metal place. So he said, "You need to come out and help me." I said, "I can't do that," because they had to do the checks for the employees. There were only 5 men there that did welding and so forth. And he said, "Oh yeah, you can do this. This is simple." So, and collect debts. And so I started working on those. we had an Arab that owned a big horse farm here in Lexington, and they had made gates for his farm, fancy iron gates, and they weren't paying on it. And the owner kept complaining about it, and I said, well, whose gates are these they haven't paid for? He said, well, I guess they're really still ours. I said, well, why don't you just go get them? Take them off the hinges and bring them back into the shop. So they did. They were in the process when the manager of the farm happened to come by, and they got their money. We had another man that owned a restaurant down at the river. He also had a collection of parrots. I don't know whether you all ever remember that or not. He had a big tent, kept these parrots, and he was actually a dentist over at Richmond, I think. Wow. And so he was paying along on the debt that he had because they had made a hood for him for the kitchen in the restaurant. And so I kept staying after the man, and he'd pay along a little each month. And finally got down to about $125, and I said to Paul, who was the owner, wonder if he'd let us just come down and eat up the $125. So I called him. He said, oh, yes, come on down. So took the men and we went out and ate up the rest of the debt. That was interesting. Well, then I had been retired 6 years, and in the meantime, I had opened a preschool. My sister was head of early childhood education at Rice State University in Dayton, Ohio. And she said, Dad, there's a desperate need most every place for preschools or daycares. So I had sold all home some land, and so I bought one of my houses back. I mean, they built a house on the land in a development. Bought a house that I thought would work, and I opened up business with, I could have 12 children. I hired a teacher, and she was there the entire time. And she became the director of Central Christian Church, this daycare, and she's still there. Wonderful young lady. So, but I had a wonderful time with these kids. I had to go back and study Montessori, which was an Italian approach to teaching little children, a wonderful way to teach. But, and I had wonderful experiences. In fact, 2 of the little boys that were in there are now grown, and they're in real estate business with their mother and father. So I hope they will eventually sell the farm. In the church here, there was a lady, Miss Ethel Stevens. Any of you remember her, Miss Ethel? Yeah. She taught us to sing "Jesus Loves Me" when we were little children. And we had stayed in touch with she and her sister. Neither of them ever married. In fact, even while I was at Paris, they drove over one day and visited with us. And then we came back to Lexington, renewed our time to be with them. Wonderful lady. I don't care what problem we were discussing in the church, she always came and always participated, regardless of her age. So when she was at Tanbark, she was renting an apartment. That was before she had to be in the nursing home. I dropped by one day and she said, "Oh, God has sent you because my hearing aids won't work." So I said, "Well, where did you get them?" She said, "Well, they're out of business." But she said, "I think Tender Cross Tinder would help me." So I was in a truck, so I had to pick her up and sit her in the front seat of the car, and off we went. And so this lady, she was talking to and telling her about her problem with her hearing aids. She said, "Is anyone with you?" And she said, "Oh yes, one of my boys." This woman looked out and she thought, "I guess, where's the boy?" Because I was gray-headed. But anyhow, and when we were through, she said, "Oh, why don't we go somewhere and get some ice cream?" So we stopped somewhere and we got ice cream cone piece, and we spilled ice cream all over us driving around in the truck. And then later, one year during back up a little bit, she wanted me to take her one night to Lawrenceburg to a funeral home for a friend of hers who died. They and I took her, and then coming back, I realized probably it was beyond the time for her to eat her supper at Tanbark. So we stopped at a restaurant, and she wanted a hamburger. and they brought hamburger and a big thing of fries. She said, "Oh, I'll never be able to eat that." Well, we talked and talked, and she ate every crumb of it. And at that time, she, over a period of time, had given $75,000 to the foundation. And Glenn had recently talked me into working with the foundation, which I resisted because I said I've never done anything like this before. And I said, "Miss Ethel, you know, you could go on and give that other $25,000, and you would know that you'd given $100,000 to the church." And she said, "Well, I'll call and ask the bank if I have it." Of course, she had plenty of money. She did, so she had given a total of $100,000 to the foundation. And going back and talking about working with the foundation, I had no knowledge of anything like this. And I told Glenn, "I can't do this." And Glenn said, "Well, the church members don't really know anything about the foundation." And Bill Embry had been involved in getting me in that position, along with Glenn Burke. And he said, "You just need to go, maybe start with the church circles and couples clubs and tell them about the foundation." So I went to 8 little ladies that did sewing, made clothes for children in the children's home at Danville. And they also did quilting and sold the quilts in order to have money to buy materials and so forth. And so I talked with them and explained what the foundation for. There was permanent funds to be used, you know, whenever the church would need them, and hopefully just using the interest off of the money. And so a week later, an attorney called me and said, "This lady wants to leave her estate to whatever it is you work with. What's the name of it?" So I said, "Well, I better talk to her first, and then I'll come to you." And she did make a will. And as far as I knew, she was pretty healthy and everything. Well, then while I had come out then and gone to Henry Clay, his principal, to fill in for a year, because the principal that was there decided to retire 2 weeks before school opened. While I was there, I had the opportunity to continue on and wrote notes for the chimes, remember the church in your will, and this kind of thing, back and forth. And we did all those kind of things. And then I got to know John Reed, who was a member of our church, a very elderly man. And he had money, had given a piano once. And of course later, I think the stained glass window in the sanctuary. So I'd go to visit him about every 6 weeks because I found out the president of Transylvania was going about that often. And John Reed smoked cigars. When I'd come out of there, I felt like I needed oxygen. And one time then I broke my foot, and he called and said, "Well, you've been coming to me, I'm calling you." But he passed away and left us in good shape with beautiful things for us to enjoy. And certainly left money for the music program, which has been so helpful. Well, in thinking about meditation and prayer, Lord, I prayed many times while I was at Tate Street. And sometimes I'd say to my secretary, "Just give me some time, Doris, to be by myself." And I'd close the door. And I had certain things in Scripture that I really liked. And later I read in Dr. Paul Sell's book, Taste and See, that this was a good idea. Certain sentences of Scripture was important. It would help you calm down if you read them, or you could read one of them over and over until you got really calm. But some that I really like very much. God knows what we need, which is part of a prayer, that our Father in heaven forgive our debts as we forgive others. From John 15:16, "You did not choose me, I chose you, so that you should go forth and bear fruit." And here we are. In John 8, verse 12, "I am the light of the world, and he who follows me shall not walk in darkness." Ecclesiastes, "A good name is more precious than ointment." And then a prayer of Moses, "Lord, thou hast been my dwelling place." And then my favorite, which you can do at the cemetery, David. I'm going to be cremated, so it'll just be crumbs that you're putting in the pan. But I like this from Corinthians. I think it's when Paul had third time had communications with the people of Corinth. But he had said to them, "My friends, farewell. And remember each other and care for each other." And then, of course, the thief on the cross, Christ said, "You shall be with me this day in paradise." And those are good things, I think, to remember. And I like certain hymns. Surely the presence of the Lord is in his place. Abide with me as darkness deepens. God, abide with me. And of course, the one I was attempting to say a while ago is, finally, brethren, farewell. Bend your ways, heed my appeal, agree with one another, live in peace, and the God of love and peace will be with you. So these are things that gave me strength in working with kids and teachers and parents. Sometimes teachers are more problems than the kids were. And each with their individual problems, and I don't know how it'd end up sometimes. They'd come in and say, "I need off tomorrow, I need to consult an attorney, need to get a divorce." And I'd say, "Oh, wait a minute." And some of them went all the way through and got divorces, some of them stayed together. But so as a high school principal and with a counseling background, it was hard work, but I enjoyed it. And I miss it to this day. I really do. I miss teenagers. And some of them are sitting around here. My wife taught David Snyder in 3rd grade, and I was his counselor in high school. And Ray back there. I don't know whether there's anybody else I had here in school. Well, one of the interesting things that I think it was the next to the last week next year before I retired, kids got pretty crazy. Seniors did near the end of school, and a young man brought a pie to school, and he was going to throw it at the man English teacher, and the English teacher found out and hid. So he came on up and knocked on my door, and I opened the door, wham! I chased him out in the parking lot. I got hold of his jacket. I don't know whether it ripped off or just came off. And I knew who he was, I'm positive. To this day, because he owns that chili parlor downtown. If I go in there, he says, "I didn't do it." And I said, "Yes, you did." Well, we just hired his wife as our finance person. And she said to me the other day, "David says he'd like to come and couldn't get here this morning." And I started to say, "Tell him to bring no pies." I thought, I'll be nice. But anyhow, it's nice to share things with you, and I'm anxious as we go along hearing other people's stories.
Thank you, Warren.